Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Dandelion Dynasty, Book 4, Speaking Bones, Chapters 42 and 43, The Battle of Pan Part 2, and The Fall of Lyucu. In these chapters, well, I told you should have killed her, Tanbanaki. But no. That's what you get. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. So, we're just going to jump right in because there is so much to talk about. Battle of Pan Part 2 begins with report from Admiral Temeruri. Attack from the west is a feint, which is, how the last chapter ended. Poor Aya. I really feel for her here in some ways, but it's interesting to see how being completely driven by one particular objective can ruin people's lives. All she wants to do is clear the family name from the disgrace of her mother being a traitor, and it's really clouding her judgment on everything. She's just constantly thinking about how to prove herself instead of thinking about how to, what she does is what Phyro predicts, which is she does things according to the textbook. And she is expecting he will be doing things this way as well. I don't know how long it has been since they have had an in-person conversation, but it appears to me that he has rightfully, estimated that she hasn't grown very much in her way of doing things, and she assumes that he hasn't either, that he is still going to, follow the rules that her mother has sort of established. And she doesn't seem to fully understand how much Phyro's approach to things has changed because of the experiences that he has had. And frankly, she hasn't been allowed to have experiences because of Gia's mistrust of the military. So in some ways, I feel bad because she's set up for failure on purpose. Gia has chosen somebody, in my opinion, who is inexperienced because she doesn't want somebody that can outwit her. And Aya really doesn't seem to understand the role that she's playing here. So she keeps thinking she's proving herself when, if she were to prove herself, I feel like she might lose her job. If she proves too well, too convincingly, that she knows what she's doing and is a good military mind, I'm not sure that helps her, actually. But she doesn't grasp this all, And Kogo says, how could Phyro have obtained the resources to construct a fleet? We should have known. We could reinforce the gates. And then in comes another messenger who says, Renga, urgent report from Tiro Kozo. The Garinafins have escaped. And this one's a way bigger deal. There was a surprise assault. They freed Ofluro and Lady Suka and took off with all the Garinafins, and before leaving, they destroyed the messenger airships and pigeons, which is why it has taken this long for the news to reach Pan. That's a pretty fucking baller move. I mean, this is when Gaia really hits the floor. She collapses. Gia had placed the Garinifan caretakers and trainers at Tiro Kozo under guard as soon as Phyro disappeared, uncertain of their loyalty. But now the entirety of the Empire's Garinifan force was under the Emperor's control, and Pon itself was without even a single airship for defense. Well, damn. Life comes at you fast, doesn't it? And Aya is like, well, we have to recall the airships, to which Gia is like, and for what? Those fucking airships against a Garinifan? What do you think that's even going to do? And Aya can't help but be like, oh, shit, yeah. Kogo is assuming that what Phyro's plan is to come in and just unleash the Garinifans on civilians. And Gia is like, oof, I even miscalculated. When you play with fire, Aya repeated the Empress's words silently. Her eyes roved over the bright silkmotic lamps in sconces all around the grand audience hall. The sconces, designed for torches, were sculpted in the shapes of the gods. Those behind the civil ministers on the eastern wall took the likenesses of Lutho, the god of calculation and foresight. Those behind the military officers on the western wall took the likeness of Ithaweo, the god of war and intuition. Renga, it's not hopeless yet. Garinifans may be fierce, but they still must see. So what they decide to do is douse the lights. And that way, there will be no way for the Garinifans to navigate. And as soon as she says this, I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, but they have created like a light-seeking weapon. Maybe this is exactly what he wants her to do. And it does seem indeed, when the time comes, she just keeps walking right into the traps that he's setting. It's like a little embarrassing. I really do feel bad for her because this girl is trying her best. You know, she's not a fool. It's not that. She's just really young. She's just really inexperienced. And I have so much sympathy for her, you know? So we see them, you know, extinguishing all of the lights, yada, yada, yada. Phyro had not wanted to turn his quest of vengeance against the woman who had murdered his mother into a civil war that would slaughter the innocent, but he could not refuse the aid of his dear friends, the Blossom Gang, Widow Wasu, and most of all Zenkara, who were as outraged by Gia's duplicity as he was. So, they had recruited. The recruits were not moralist scholars. They were not incentivist officials. They simply knew that a son had a duty to avenge the death of his mother, and that people were bound to stick knives in their own ribs if that would help a friend in need. Earlier they had slipped through deserted streets and slithered through waterlogged sewers to stir up chaos in all quarters of the city, starting fires, pretending to be ghosts, putting on shows with smoke, mirrors, and gongs. Now that the city had been plunged into darkness, it was time for the next phase of the plan. Like drops of rain zigzagging across a pane of glass to commingle at the trough at the bottom of the window, they congregated at the deserted plaza before the examination hall. While the best of Dara's scholars gathered here once every 5 years to fight for a chance to be elevated into the upper echelons of Dara's machinery of government, it was hardly a target of military importance. There were no garrisons of soldiers, no guards keeping watch, but Mota Kifi was waiting for them. And they create barricades and whatnot, and they bust through the doors and climb onto the catwalks. The locked door leading up to the roofs hardly slowed them as they rammed through. There, heedless of the relentless rain, they pried up the roofing tiles and assaulted the battens until they had made a gaping hole. The interior of the examination hall, now accessible to the sky, was soon drenched by torrents of cascading water. Mota rallied the rebels to disassemble the whale oil lamps and curved mirrors around the rim of the ceiling and install them on the central platform. Normally, these lamps were used during 3-day examinations. Now, however, Mota and his rebels had turned the curved mirrors to direct all light into a single beam that shot upward and out of the hole in the roof, piercing the rainy darkness. Well. So, this is when Aya is pointing out and being like, all right, there it is. Beside the crossbow lay 6 diamond-tipped silkmotic bolts recovered from the waters of Zathan Gulf and lovingly restored. Similar crossbow stations had been erected on other sides of the palace as well. Aya Mazzotti would use her mother's weapons to defend the city against a new Garinafin threat, but she had also been prepared for another possibility: sabotage. The strange disturbances around the city had alerted her to the presence of rebel sympathizers in Pan. If Phyro intended to invade the city by Garinafin, then it was almost certain that the saboteurs would act as his guides and spotters, eyes and ears. Her order for all the lights to be extinguished, besides taking away Garinafin's sight, had also been a trick to force the saboteurs to reveal themselves. So, this is when we transfer back to Phyro's POV. And I can't do this like beat by beat because, like I said, there is a lot to talk about here. But he is... Let's see. I'm trying to get to the spot where he's talking here. Are you scared? Terrified. It was cold up here in the realm of birds and cloud palaces. Phyro's drenched hair whipping about his face. He laughed heartily. Good. This will get the blood flowing before we reach the Empress. The great silkmotic Dyron arced through the sky, its sunflower-inspired Oclium eye locked unwaveringly on the bright glow at the heart of Pan. Faster and faster, the missile flew, its beacon brightening ahead. And, I feel like I should be a lot more worried for him than I am. She's sitting waiting, but, Aya has not been super competent, so I'm like, So... Aya is getting I just said that. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Aya is getting impatient. The rebel saboteurs were far more skilled than she'd anticipated, and her own soldiers had made little progress at breaching the examination hall. A new idea entered her head. If the rebels were calling the Garinafins here, then this was where she would hunt them. So she dispatches messengers, and then in the sky, she hears this whistling. This wasn't the Garinafin assault she had imagined. It was rather a mindless, fantastical simulacrum of a rainbow-tailed Dyron. Phyro wasn't coming to Pan after all, not personally. He was going to deal death to the capital from afar using weapons meant for the Lyucu. And again, just not fucking understanding what's happening here. So Aya is like, well, I guess that he is just going to discard all of our lives. I never would have thought it of him, but here we go. And we have to do our duty. And everybody around her is getting themselves sort of psyched up because for a moment, it's just like despair. And then it's, they're watching the Garinafin get closer. This must be how my mother felt during the Battle of Zathan Gulf, as she ordered her soldiers to hold their fire until they could see their own reflections in the cold, pupilless eyes of the Garinafins. And again, I'm just like, girl, you have got to leave your mother out of this. Like, I truly... So, remind me, Kyle... There was a letter that Gia got about Aya's performance a while back. And Gia's interpretation was that Aya was being judged really harshly by the letter writer. And that she was likely a lot more competent than this person was making her look. And I can't recall if Gia was making that argument aloud, and if maybe she was trying to convince somebody else of something, or if that was like in her mind, that was how she was interpreting things, and we were just told that. But, when I read that letter, I think I even said in the recording that it had never occurred to me that maybe the person had been misrepresenting what happened. And that I felt a little bit silly because Gia seemed able to see through the bias, and I hadn't picked that up at all. But I'm starting to think like maybe Gia was reading into it too much, and maybe she just isn't as good as she's thinking. The mechanical Dyron was so close she could hear its whirling tail. Fire! She swung the sword. The giant silkmotic bolt lurched out of the flight groove, flexing as it sped at the approaching missile. It reminded Aya of a scene from some old shadow puppet play. Her eyes snapped shut as a blinding flash erased the night. And then we go back to Phyro's POV. And he is telling Arona, "It's okay, we are safe." He pulled the cord, and with a loud thwump, their precipitous fall slowed. Again, he had just fully predicted that this was going to be how she handled the situation. Phyro had no interest in laying waste upon or harming its people. That would not be Muta-J. He simply needed to convince the cunning but cowardly Gia that he would. With her air force lured away, the paranoid empress would scurry into hiding, would plunge the city into darkness, leaving Motakifi the opening to light the beacon and summon his true aerial steed. And it's interesting how Gia was so correct in some ways about Phyro's thinking about this in terms of needing there to be a one-on-one confrontation. He does have that romantic streak, and even kind of admits that he has a mental image of how this is going to take place and the final face-to-face moments. But he isn't willing to risk everybody else on behalf of it. And what I like about this is that Phyro is managing to be both somebody who is very martial, but not insensitive to the loss of life, which I feel like Gia doesn't believe is a possibility. I think she really is thinking, either you are a mindless warrior who doesn't value human life and sees people as a means to an end, or you are a pacifist. And I enjoy seeing Phyro proving her wrong. He is out here, wanting to go to war for what is right, wanting to stand up for his people, but he is going to find a way around doing the most bloody obvious thing, which she had just assumed was going to be his first move. And she really, really underestimated him. So the explosion in the academic quarter had drawn the attention of all the patrolling detachments. Congregating around the examination hall, they reinforced Aya Mazzoti's palace guards and laid siege to the building. Though its main purpose had been fulfilled, Motakifi continued to maintain the bright beacon and rallied the rebels to hold the makeshift fortress. Their task now was to draw the attention of Gia's defenders, buying Phyro and Arona time to do their work. As long as the defenders believed that more missiles or Garinifins would be summoned by the beacon, they would have to focus their efforts on Mota's diversion. So this is when somebody comes to Aya and is like, hey, that Dyron was not armed, actually. And she just yells to the soldiers to keep attacking, put out that beacon, and try to capture as many of the rebels alive as possible. And I'm just thinking, God, you really do not know when to cut your losses, girl. So then we go to Phyro, and he is looking at the portrait of his mother and is wanting her blessing for what he is about to do, which I feel, if he really thought about it, he would know she wouldn't be willing to give him that blessing. Roxana was just a certain type. And she would 100% be the type to say, you've got to let that shit go, babe. I'm not saying let her be queen, but killing her and saying you're doing it for me is not going to fly. But I don't suppose you can convince him of that in this moment, you know? Ready for the next step? I'll go scout a bit. He saw the palace's western wall, dark and deserted. Beyond the wall, he could see the bright beacon of the examination hall. He imagined the fierce fighting taking place. Moda's orders were to hole up inside and defend as long as possible and keep up the pretense. So then he sees that the darkness, you know, people are starting to light fires and stuff again, and there are torches. And he is looking at this spot where, or not a spot, but just like the pattern. Aya was an inexperienced military commander and too book-bound. But the imperial princess was not foolish. His ruse wouldn't deceive Aya forever. Phyro was now certain that atop the dark walls were many soldiers, crouching behind crenellations, bows and crossbows ready. Aya and Kogo must already suspect that the exploded mechanical Dyron had not been without passengers, and this was their way to ferret out intruders within the palace. The moving patrols with torches were bait, intended to lure him and his band into making a rash move. Though the patrols moved about seemingly at random, they left gaps in between that were too tempting. And I really like the fact that he can like look at this and be like, okay, girly, I see what you're trying to do. And he overhears some people talking about whether or not they found anything. Take Teke with you and go to the second fin. She needs help at the examination hall. But who's going to watch the grand audience hall? Leave that to the palace guards. Not important. And I couldn't tell if this was a setup or not. It felt so, we'll specifically mention a particular place that isn't going to be guarded because we don't think it's important. And it felt like, I don't know. So Phyro is listening and thinking about how paranoid Gia must be by this time. And again, she was sending the Dyron Fins out to take over defense duties. This was an unexpected stroke of luck. And again, I'm like, is it? Or is it the fucking setup, buddy? Like, you know? He just like, considering how wily Gia is, I felt like he was underestimating her a little bit. It's one thing for him to set Aya up the way that he has. He knows Aya personally, and he knows that she is inexperienced. So that combo, it makes, but I feel like Gia, I don't know if you're managing that. He knew that dropping into the palace from afar, appealed to his romantic yearning for a pure moment of confrontation. So he peeks out again. Where was the Empress hiding? And he's thinking at first, like, maybe she's surrounded by soldiers. And then he's like, no, she doesn't trust them. She's not going to do that. And then he starts thinking about Kogo Yelu. And the fact that he plays Kupa. I don't know how I'm saying, like, it's a C-U-P-A and there's an umlaut over the U. I have no idea how to pronounce that. I'm so sorry. So he, using like the rules of Kupa, is looking out and trying to see if there's a pattern that rings true for that style of gameplay. And he sees a blank spot. It looks like it's near the hall where the chefs prepare meals. There was a story from the early days about how Prime Minister had discovered the talent of Marshal Ginmazotti by playing a game of Kupa. In the empty space lay danger, possibility, temptation, and redemption. I'm ready, Renga, Arona whispered from the sanctum above. Your turn. Phyro smiled to himself and climbed back up. So, you know, like, I don't know, man. I feel like he's being set up. I do. So now we go to chapter 43. This is really something. So we start off in the POV of what is his name? Vokufirna. And Vokufirna is said later to be dead. And I don't know if that is Goztan lying to protect him, or if he has actually died since this scene. Because, you know, he is really, really weakened. So there is a possibility that he dies off screen. But I don't know. It sort of made me wonder, like, maybe she managed to save him somehow. And this is the guy, you know, who had been trying to save some of the Dara, like, religious relics, and he was much more interested in there being a coexistence. And he has written a poem. Gaunt, long-haired cattle wander the rubble. Next to the wharves, barnacles encrust the chains of city ships too decrepit to trust, to brave the waves. Fish whisper of trouble. No one tends to the cooking fire. Neglected Gerinifins low with need and hunger. In abandoned fields choked by weeds, younger barbarians seethe and their plots grow dire. And it goes on like this, like, it's quite affecting, but I don't have time to read the whole thing because it's pretty long. So this is what he leaves behind. And then we go to Tamvanaki, and hers starts with, Tamvanaki felt that all she did these days was scream. And you guys, I know I said this in my intro, but I have to say it again. I cannot believe that she doesn't kill Kutan Rovo. I truly am blown away by the fact that Tamvanaki never takes that step. It almost feels out of character. That's how frustrated I am. I don't know. I would be very interested to hear from listeners if they agree with me on this, because I feel like Pekyu Tenryo would have taught her that somebody like Kutan Rovo, there was a point at which Tamvanaki was at Kutan Rovo's mercy due to the support that she had. But that time has passed. And now Kutan Rovo is really in revolt and also doesn't seem to have the support of almost anybody. And this is the fucking time. And I found it almost surprising that Tamvanaki is as shocked by Kutan Rovo's disobedience. Disobedience? Is that the word? Disobedience. That's the one. As she is. Because I feel that Kutan Rovo has been nothing if not fucking consistent. And it is obvious that she is going to do what the fuck she feels like. Always. Like, that's never not been the way she handles shit. So Kutan Rovo is telling her we've run out of food. It's the fault of the native officials. They've been lying to me about the harvest figures. And Goztan is like, of course, because you would fucking kill them if they gave you bad news, so they told you what you wanted to hear. What about the land you've reclaimed? The weather has not been cooperative, and land reclaimed from the sea yielded grass that sickened cattle and sheep. Any native farmer could have told you that such salty soil would be useless for crops or grazing, but since you executed any who dared to speak up, those who objected were Dara Ra'aki saboteurs. And they go back and forth for a while. And all Kutan Rovo does is whine about how shit didn't work out because everybody's against her. And how we've got saboteurs and treasonous and blah, blah, blah. And eventually, Kutan Rovo says, well, here's the thing. I have said natives could volunteer for labor gangs, and in exchange for work, they'd be fed. Why don't you tell the Pekyu what sort of work the labor gangs were doing and what you were feeding them, prodded Goztan, her face a mask of rage. Kutan Rovo shrugged. I assigned Noda, me, and Weira Pin to set the workings to building the cliffside engines. And Tom Vanaki is like, what? The treaty, the whole thing was that we wouldn't build that. And Kutan Rovo's like, who the fuck cares what we said in the treaty? Like, what do you even mean? Why are you even bringing that up? And this is the sort of shit that is so incredibly short-sighted. Like, Kutan Rovo is living in a fantasy world. She is so unwell, this woman, that she really thinks she could just, like, lay into anybody who doesn't agree with her, make promises, not keep them, and that she can just continue to operate that way, and that anybody's ever going to want to continue to work with her. And this, what she's giving here for me, is really reminding me of Cersei in A Feast for Crows, because Cersei has a similar attitude where it's everybody is against her unless they can do something for her. And even then she has to, like, keep an eye on them. And she will make promises with the intent to break them as soon as she can, without any thought to what breaking that kind of faith can do to relationships in terms of diplomacy, in terms of alliances. Like, there is no thought given to the big picture and trying to maintain a reputation that people want to work with. And Kutan Rovo has the exact same, like, short-sightedness going on here. And Ghostan, you know, I appreciate her being here, and I think that she's going to be the one that, like, saves the day at the end of this chapter. We don't know what happens, but I think she will. The slaves were told the cages would be used to catch whales. They're too stupid to understand what they're building anyway. As for food, since I couldn't use beef, mutton, or grain, I turned to the next best thing. I began with the bodies of sacrificial victims. Even if a bit rotten, after sufficient boiling, the flesh could be rendered suitable for consumption, and the smell was easily disguised with pepper and coconut. When we ran out of corpses, I instituted a work quota system. Any worker who couldn't meet his quota for the day was executed and used to make that night's dinner. And Tom Vanaki is losing her shit here. And Kutan Rovo is like, why are you so upset? You told me I needed to keep them fed. Who cares? And Ghostan is like, I can't believe you're trying to act like you don't know how fucked up this is. You're a fucking monster. And Kutan Rovo says, well, if it's any comfort, we haven't completed any of the engines. Nodami's drawings turned out to be worthless. Or maybe the laborers engaged in sabotage. The first cage fell apart before it could even be finished. And that's what was predicted back at court, so I want to give them some credit here. I can't remember. Was it Zomi who was saying that, like, I don't think that this is even going to be buildable? I think it was Zomi at the time that she was still part of the court, right? And Ghostan says to disguise the source of the meals, Thane Kutan Rovo had the overseers grind the corpses until they were unrecognizable. The work gangs did the work and ate the stew, not realizing what they were building or eating. But when one of the cooks grew careless and left a child's hand intact in the stew, the workers realized the truth and rebelled. They captured the guards who confessed the true purpose of the engines. And Kutan Rovo was like, yeah, well, I had to suppress it and rely on fighters with accommodation as sympathies, and they weren't as effective as I hoped. This is so, like, it's practically cartoonish. And Tom Vanaki is like, I cannot believe what a fucking mess you've made. You were supposed to stabilize things, and all you've done is make it worse. And Kutan Rovo, I am not afraid of swine with 2 legs. You act as if feeding the natives with their own flesh is beyond the pale, but the Peku Votan once suggested the very same thing. And this is when Tom Vanaki loses her cool and jumps on Kutan Rovo and begins to strangle her. And she should have fucking finished. I was a bit bummed that Ghostan told her to back off. I just needed her to fucking finish the job. Kutan Rovo deserves to die. She is insubordinating. She has been for ages. It's long overdue. And the whole thing is so, like, to me, crystal clear. Tom Vanaki says, you're the most dangerous kind of fool, the kind that believes her own lies. You thought you were doing what was best, and for that reason alone, I am sparing you. And all of a sudden, she hears Timu's words, have you really looked at the world outside the great tent? Timu's words felt like a slap to the face. She herself was the most dangerous kind of fool. She thought she was doing the best for the Lyucu. She had believed her own lies. While Kutanrovo had made a mess of things, she had been paralyzed by fear and hope instead of doing the only thing worth doing, confronting reality. Which is really, considering how things go later, it's amazing that she comes to this conclusion and then does what she does. So Tom Vanaki says, all right, we've got to diffuse the situation. Set the slaughter engines on fire and let everybody see it. And we need a scapegoat. So we're going to have to kill Weerapin and Notami and flay them alive and parade their skins around. And this is when Kutanrovo begins to protest and is just like, you can't show such weakness. And Tom Vanaki comes over to her and is like, I would fucking flay you if you weren't Lyucu. This is about to completely burn down. And she says, we have got to write and beg Gia for aid. Beg? You can't mean you must threaten. I do mean beg. Don't you get it? This was her plan all along. And she has a moment of like, I gotta hand it to the bitch. She really figured us out. There's nothing we can do except beg for her mercy. Who do you want to be the envoy? Asked Goztan. Well, the best choice, of course, is Timu, assuming I haven't shattered his heart. We should send Vokafirna. Voku is dead, said Goztan. She glanced at Kutanrovo and choked back the rest of her bitter speech. I really hope he's not, but, you know. So then we go to Kutanrovo's POV. Now, I am going to be really honest with you guys. I skimmed her POV. Being in her head is really, really awful. And this section was pretty repetitive. Like, I get it. I understand who Kutanrovo is. I don't really need this to go on as long as it does, explaining why she's making the decision she's making. I know exactly who she is. It's only Tom Vanaki that doesn't seem to get it. And she's like in this, you know, tent, and she's trying to figure out what to do. She's completely blown away at what Tom Vanaki is willing to do in going to Gia and begging for help. And even if Gia had somehow grown a spine, she believed the Lyucu would survive the winter with no problems. There were plenty of two-legged swine for everyone to feast upon. Which I really wonder, if she had gotten her way, would all the rest of the Lyucu agree to eat the natives? Would that be what they... Like, how much of a hold does Kutanrovo's ideology have on everybody? Could she convince them that this was fine? Because she's managed to convince them to do bonkers shit, but it has always been with the help of the drug that she doesn't have anymore. And I can't decide whether that would work or not. And even if it did work, on, like, you know, if you don't have anything but human flesh, y'all are, first of all, gonna run out of people. But secondly, that is not going to meet your nutritional needs, and you're going to be in some bad fucking shape. So it would still not work out, but I just really wonder if they would go along with it. As for the rebellion, the specter of rebellion by the native garrisons and villagers, the risk was obviously exaggerated. The natives were cowardly, craven, divided, and even if they tried to fight, a single wolf was as good as 100 sheep. So again, she's just totally like sticking to her image of what is happening instead of looking at the reality. And then here comes Notami. And we jump from him coming to her to then Notami reporting to Tom Vanaki. And he tells this goofy fucking story that I can't believe Tom Vanaki falls for, about how Kutanrovo has been captured and how I can't believe we let ourselves get, like, you know, the whole way that he plays this is, we were fools to fall for it. I know how important she is. This is all my fault. And Tambanaki is completely buying this, and also falls for the thing that, because she sees initially that it's a trap, which it is. Of course it is. But all Norami has to do is be like, oh, of course we couldn't ask you to take such a risk. You're too important. And sort of poke at her pride a little bit and make it sound like she's afraid to check. And she immediately takes the bait. And this moment, Of course it's a trap. How could I have been so stupid? Tambanaki's face flushed. Noda's prattle bothered her more than she cared to admit. Was this how her thanes saw her? Whatever Kutan Rovo's faults, she was loyal. She was Lyucu, and she had to be saved. Loyal where? Kutan Rovo isn't loyal in any way except to this mythical Lyucu spirit. She has not done what Tambanaki has ordered almost ever. I do not understand her calling Kutan Rovo loyal, and I do not understand how somebody can be insubordinate as many times as Kutan Rovo has been and not be executed. This woman is a liability. I just don't buy this. I really it's so frustrating because I have wanted Kutan Rovo to die for so long that I want to celebrate more. But because of how it happens, I feel like I can't, because I thought Tambanaki was a lot smarter than this. And I feel like I've watched her get stupider. I feel like I can't decide if I overestimated her initially, or if something just had to happen with her, that her character was made to be more foolish than I thought so that she could be fooled. But this is not quite hitting for me. It's just, it feels like she isn't operating according to the values of the scrublands that she was born and raised on, and certainly not operating according to the rules that I would believe her father was operating on. Like, he would never have tolerated somebody disobeying him and defying him to his face. And I understand that she's in a distinctly different position of less power in terms of but that's all the more reason that the woman you've been relying on being this disconnected from reality and this unwilling to follow orders is such a problem. So I just have a really hard time with the fact that Kutan Rovo has been allowed to get away with as much as she has for as long as she has. It's just not feeling true to me. Tambanaki had an excuse when Kutan Rovo had the people behind her. That's over. She has put them in the position of potentially being overrun by rebelling natives now. She is causing the problems now. And I don't know. So her being like, oh, she's loyal. What the fuck are you talking about? She's disloyal. She doesn't listen to you, and she clearly doesn't respect you. And she's made that very clear over and over again. Ugh. So here we go. Tambanaki gave a wan smile. Was this how it would all end? The Pekyu of Ukyutaasa brought down by a few emaciated peasants who overwhelmed her by sheer numbers. Why did she feel no fear, no regret? She needed to stop thinking like Kutan Rovo, treating every move by the natives as some sly scheme to destroy the Lyucu. She needed to exercise a long-dormant capacity, empathy. Why did the rebels demand to see her as well as Timu? It was because they still believed in him as a symbol. And I'm thinking girl, come on. it is so clear Kutanrovo is behind this. Like, the whole thing just reeks. And the fact that she is not sensing this. Kutanrovo has done everything but outright rebellion. It is incredibly predictable that she is now going to try for a coup. Like, come on. Ugh. This was so frustrating to read, you guys. Like, I wanted this to hit more, and it was just... I hate being in the position where I feel like I have to sit through something unfolding that I have already figured out. It's one thing if you're gleeful to see how it shakes out. It's another thing when it's like just a situation filled with dread that you don't want to happen. And just really topping it off with the fact that I thought Kutanrovo, or that I thought Tambanaki was smarter than this, which is just so disappointing in that sense. So, anyway, this whole thing, she could blame Kutanrovo's inflexible devotion to tradition, or at least an imagined version of it. She could blame the selfish council of advisors like Noda Me, but in the end, she was the Pekyu. She was responsible. For so long, she'd been hiding from the truth, terrified that her compassion would be aroused by the fate of the enslaved, a reminder of the Lyucu's own suffering under Pekyu Nobo Aragos of the Aegon. And she had isolated herself, lest her natural empathy manifest itself as weakness and lead to the destruction of her own people. But the time for hiding was over. And Timu would be there by her side to hold her up and give her strength. She was grateful for that. The least she could do was have the courage to face the truth. So, then we have the whole thing. Kutanrovo waiting for her. Tambanaki seeing that this feels like a trap and still not fucking leaving. It's so obvious. I don't understand it. Like, am I supposed to think that Tambanaki is basically... like consciously walking into this trap? Like, is she deluding herself on purpose? I don't know. I don't really understand what I'm supposed to think of her here. But you know, this whole thing, she's like noticing shit doesn't look right, and then Kutanrovo does the whole like, oh, I'm ill, I must have been poisoned, you know, play acting. And Tambanaki goes to her, and then Kutanrovo knocks her down, unties herself, and then begins to attack Tambanaki. And Timu doesn't even get a chance to really react before Tambanaki is laid completely out. And Kutanrovo winds up stabbing her with his writing knife because she's planning on framing Timu for it. And then she's going to bash Timu's head in and be like, I caught him and he killed Tambanaki, which honestly, as much as it's like a goofy fucking ruse, it's also probably something that would work, because people are very willing to go with the most obvious story if the person telling it is the one who has all the power. Like, understandably, you don't want to stand against somebody when it seems everybody else is on their side and all they need to do is snap their fingers and they can have you dragged in front of them and beheaded. So if she was like, oh, now I'm the Pekyu because Timu was so angry that he stabbed his wife and that would probably fucking hold up, you know? Like, so anyway, Kutanrovo is saying the Lyucu don't negotiate, we conquer. And this thing, it's just, again, Kutanrovo like repeating the same, you will never understand us. A little Tolyusa thirst is nothing. A rebellion by every mud-legged native in Ukyataasa is nothing. Your brother's invasion, no matter how many witchcraft-infused weapons he brings, is nothing. The Lyucu spirit, on the other hand, is everything. You're right that you're very valuable. We may not be able to build the slaughter engines, but we can still strike Gia where it really hurts. So she's thinking at first that she's going to be able to use Timu as a bargaining chip And Timu, for some reason, thinks it's like a really smart idea to tell her that his mother would never, ever bargain for him. Now, I get it. He's doing this in the moment because he thinks that maybe it'll get her to stop and save Tamanaki's life. But, dude, you'll never defeat her with such threats. Then we'll die as warriors, as is our nature, declared Kutanrovo, sounding not only proud but overjoyed. It's better than begging for mercy from people fit only to be slaves. Wolves must never become dogs. And Kutanrovo, tells him they're not going to think that I killed her, so of course I'll be able to take over as Pikyu. And then Norami is holding Timu back while Kutanrovo kills Tambanaki. And Kutanrovo stands up and is like, all right, well, I guess I have to kill you too since you're not worth anything. And she is about to attack Timu. A blurred shape rushing by him. Kutanrovo still bent over, wrapping her fingers around the war club. The blurred shape stopping next to Kutanrovo and resolving into Norami, unsheathing a sword and lunging forward. Kutanrovo's head snapping up as she looked uncomprehending at Norami's sword sliding into her body. So, I wanted so much to enjoy this, you guys, but the fact that Tambanaki was already dead by the time Kutanrovo died, I couldn't enjoy it. Because I wanted Kutanrovo to die so that Tambanaki could be the smart one and fix things. If she's out of the situation now, everybody is just screwed. The only person left is Ghost Hunt. And I really hope that she steps up. Like, I don't know what else, So Norami, whole back and forth. At one point, Kutanrovo gets on top of him and is like biting into his face. Another Song of Ice and Fire feel thing, like from Feast for Crows. And it finally ends with her dead, and Timu and Noda are sitting with each other, and Noda just begins to talk about how shit's going to work. He's like, I can't believe how easy they are to fool. They were talking about just giving me a barbarian wife like some prize. They thought they were using me. That's not how this fucking works. And then he starts talking about that we have to hide. There'll be a lot of confusion, and then we will go to Dara and be greeted as heroes. We killed the barbarian chiefs. Can you imagine the celebration when you show up? You'll have more than enough political capital to challenge your brother for the throne, and your embarrassing marriage to that semi-literate brute will be forgotten. And he doesn't get that Timu actually loved Tambanaki, which is truly so sad that he did. Like, this is how it is with abuse victims. But, ew, I hate it. And Noda is getting impatient because Temu is like not getting it. And he's starting to realize, oh, okay, this kid's like a bookworm and he's not smart about like the tactics with this stuff. And he's like, well, yeah, you've got exactly what you need to challenge him. When I present Empress Gia with the heads of Tambanaki and Kutanrovo, as well as the living, breathing form of her favorite son, she'll have no choice but to treat me as the savior of Dara. Which, it's really hilarious that he thinks this is going to work. Like, Noda is going to be presenting an eyewitness to the fact that he, like, all of the participation he played with the Lyucu and how cowardly the whole way he carried this thing off. Like, if you think Temu isn't going to tell her the exact truth, and if you think that Gia wouldn't guess the exact truth, because your nature is all over your face. Everybody knows what kind of fuckboy you are. It's wild that he is under the impression he is going to be celebrated, that she'll make him a king. He has these like fucking pie in the sky fantasies about how this is going to go down. And dude, you are scum to these people. Even if you had killed them, I don't think that's enough to make up for what they think of you at this point. Like, it's, I just don't see it. So at this point, Timu brings up his children and is like, well, what do we tell them? And he's like, who the fuck cares? You can, they'll have no place at the court. You can take as many consorts as you like to produce children. And he kicks Tamvanaki, and Timu is like, what the fuck? Don't you talk about my kids that way, or my wife? And Noda's like, you can't be serious. They're half-breeds. They are my children, and there are tens of thousands of children just like them. What will happen to the people of Ukyataasa while you and I run off to the Big Island? They won't be able to keep the peace. How many will die? Who cares? The more people die, the more glorious will appear our victory. And they really, it's like this kind of argument back and forth until finally Timu is like, all right, this guy is nuts. I am going to have to play it. Like, I agree. And then do what I need to do a little bit later. And I'm not excited about it because I'm probably going to have to like cut this guy's throat in his sleep. But I'm going to have to. So he pretends that he's going to go with it. But Noda is clearly still suspicious. So what Noda does is test him by going to behead Tamvanaki because he wants the head for proof. And he sees from Timu's reaction to this desecration of his wife's corpse that there is no way Timu is going to be able to like follow instructions. It's not going to happen. This whole thing, it's so frustrating. If I can't have the cooperation of your mind, I'll have to settle for the cooperation of your corpse. I am a man of mere flesh and blood, so I have to make sure I survive above all. I do need to thank you, however, for reminding me of another way to get what I want. Your children. I'll bring your head, as well as Tamvanaki's, and with you dead, those two sniveling Lyucu spawn will be all that remains of your bloodline. That has to be worth something to Gia and Phyro. But then you'll have to go back to... Timu stopped, finally understanding. Nodami sheathed his sword and took out the writing knife again. Carefully, meticulously, almost as though he was putting on makeup, he cut himself on the forehead, on his upper arm, on his thighs. Timu shivered uncontrollably. He should have known he was no match for Nodami when it came to plots and schemes. He was a failure to his family. All he knew were useless words. He couldn't protect Dara. He couldn't protect Ukyataasa. He couldn't protect his family. He was nothing but a fool. There's one more thing you will do for me, said Noda, his voice cold as the glint from the edge of his sword. Write a note to the children so that they'll come with me without resistance. It's the only thing you can do unless you want them to join you on the other side of the river on which nothing floats. And that's how the chapter ends. And I am going to predict that Ghostan steps in here, intercedes somehow. I don't have a good, the only thing I can say is that she hears Tamvanaki and Temu were lured out somewhere and immediately fucking figures out what that means. But that's kind of all I've got. So I don't know, but I'm over time, so I do have to wrap up. But yeah, I'm really, really curious because the way that this ends and the way that Phyro's ends, I can't decide if this is a book with a happy ending. You know, I want it to be. Things have been so awful. But, yeah. And the whole thing about the way this series is written is it's about cycles and it's about how endless the changes are and how history is just like fucking bloodshed and it's sort of never over. So how do you end a book like that? You know, how do you even, I don't know. But yeah, so anyway, I'm sorry that I'm not more pleased with Tamanaki's death. I wish I was. I really do. But you know, sometimes it is what it is. And maybe something will happen after this that'll make up for it a little bit. I'm glad at least Ghost Hunt's still alive. So that's something. All right. Thank you guys again. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.